Good afternoon, everyone. We now start with our third session of the day. This session is shared by Engineer Digu Aruchamy, Technology Innovation Manager, Sensing and Control Systems, Barcelona, Spain. Engineer Digu has completed Bachelor's in Energy and Environmental Engineering from Tamil Nadu Agriculture University and joined European Masters in Environmental Studies from Autonomous University of Barcelona, Spain, Hamburg University of Technology, Germany, and Western State Colorado University, USA. He has expertise in the areas like sustainability, especially in industrial GHG emission leakage and urban air quality monitoring, sensor solutions, building smart energy management, GHG emission management, climate and ESG disclosures and reporting, sustainability consulting, water sustainability, and waste management. Today, Sir is here to enhance our knowledge about sustainable cities. Now, I invite Engineer Digu to take over the session. We welcome you, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the warm, kind introduction. First of all, it's really a pleasure to connect, and then also, especially being an alumni of TNAU and Agriculture Engineering Institute, Research Institute. I think it's a very important honor for me to be able to give this session. And so I'm thankful to Professor Balaji Kannan and also Subramanian sir for inviting me for giving this talk today. And I think the topic sustainability cities is a very important topic, I think, in the context that all of us are living in. And but also it's a very broad topic. In fact, I did my master's in the topic, and you can do a complete PhD on the topic in every small aspects of a sustainable city. So I've tried to structure this talk over the next 1.5 hours in a way to give all of you a more overview and also to give the different context. Both from a global perspective and also some Indian context as well, and then we can have a discussion in the later part of the session about the contents. And if you have any questions in the middle, I think you can also send a message, and I can probably also pick up the conversations as during the lecture. Let me share my screen. As you would have read in the abstract of the lecture, the different topics that I'm going to cover, and try to keep it as diverse as possible, considering the diverse nature of the participants, and also try to be combine technical aspects as well as generic aspects to give you a more global perspective of the topic. So we will look at start from the history of like the urbanization, the context, and where we have come through, and currently what challenges that cities are facing around the world, and also what are how it's being managed in different contexts of, for example, population growth or rapid urbanization that's happening around the world, as well as important issues around climate change. And also we'll, in the later part of the lecture, we'll also look at how the cities of the future will be and where we are heading as society to where we are looking to live in the future, in the next 30-40 years. So since I'm based in Barcelona, so I've also wanted to use the history of the city to give a context of urbanization, because it has a very important role to play in shaping the theory of urbanization in the early 18th and 19th century, I would say, and how the cities, the European cities, because they were one of the pioneers in urbanization, so since the time of the Roman period, and so there is a lot of literature written around that. But Barcelona has a special place because when you see Barcelona, so this is the city of Barcelona. So it's a very compact city. So I'm not sure how many of you been to Europe, but compared to, for example, American cities, European cities are, at least the old cities are very dense. Essentially, they were essentially because of their history of the Roman Empire, and everything was built around a wall. So you end up having cities that are very, very dense. But and Barcelona is especially dense, considering that, of course, the how a city is built and designed always goes in line with the geography and the climate of the place where it comes from. So you will, it's also the same in India, that you would find where the cities that are from the southern part of India or the northern part of India are very different, because they also are built in order to adjust to the local weather and geographical conditions. So Barcelona, we have the sea, and so the Mediterranean Sea and the mountains on this side. So it's kind of it's a bit like Mumbai, where it is kind of sandwiched between this. So there is very limited space to grow, expand horizontally. So that what they have done is that the city kind of grows vertically and also very dense. And so to give you an idea, it's a very, very dense city, because typically you think European or Western cities are not so densely populated like in India, but in contrast, it's a very dense city. And about 1.7 million people live in the city area, around 4 million in the metropolitan region. Of course, for an Indian context, it's a small city, but for a European context, it's quite a big city. And then it also has a very nicely designed the city center, but also the outer part, which is called the AECRI region. And I wanted to talk about the photo on the bottom right, because that's where the theory of urbanization. So it has an important origin in that in Barcelona. So the history goes back to the 1850s. So when the whole city was just inside the Roman wall, the old Roman wall that was built. And then the city was kind of literally suffocating within the wall because of the huge influx of rural population coming in for work, and like what typically it also happens in Indian cities now. So you have a lot of urban slums that are there in Indian cities, because you have a lot of migration coming in, and then the local infrastructure cannot meet the demand. So the urban planners and the city governments decided, okay, let's get rid of the wall and let's expand beyond the wall. And so and they gave the work to this engineer called Ildefons Cerda. And so he's kind of considered one of the fathers of urbanization, because he invented the term urbanization. And he wrote his general theory of urbanization in 1867, which is considered still one of the Bibles for urban planners around the world. And since he's an engineer and not an architect, so he kind of went how engineers look at a solution. And so he was looking at so he did a very important study about what a modern city should be. And so this is in the 19th century. And in fact, he went to the point of calculating the volume of atmospheric air that one person needed to breathe correctly, and also determine what professions the different populations do and how these professions. So it's essentially what currently in management approach, we talk about design thinking. That is, you essentially think about what's the end use is going to be, what the customers are going to be, and then you design the product, and not the other way around. So essentially, he was a very important forefathers of the term urbanization, and I wanted to talk about that. And one of the important conclusions that we had was that the narrower the city streets were, the more deaths occurred. I think so. That was one of the reasons that you'll see. This is the AECRI district that was designed in the end of in the middle of 19th century Barcelona. And you would see that these streets are very wide, literally about 4-lane streets. And even though they didn't have cars that time, so he already saw that in the future there will be vehicles moving, and even set a speed limit for the streets. And one of the things that he was very important was, he wanted to have that irrespective of the social status of the different people, everybody should have access to the same uh, public parks or roads and things like that. All the amenities have to be more equally distributed. So that's one of the kind of revolutionized the way urban planners thought about cities in that during the 19th and the early 20th century. And you would also think of it like, for example, some of the cities that were designed in India, for example, Chandigarh, for example, or New Delhi, the new capital that was designed. Also, you would see the space that were built by considered. They were already thinking, I don't know, 50 years into the future, how cities should be. So they were really thinking about. So I think this very important part of urban planning is very, very important, because the moment you get things right from the beginning, it kind of is easier to manage the city and from a more sustainable perspective in the future. And so this is just to give you a perspective of how the urban planning and sustainable urban development is considered in the West. And also this is essentially how cities are also thought about when urban planners think, but of course from the local factors and how it is managed in the present context makes it all the different things quite challenging when the cities are currently managed, depending, because you have a lot of issues around how politics works, how society evolves, how economic development happens. So that all affects how a city is less or more sustainable. So before I go into the topic of sustainable cities, I also want to be clear about what is sustainable development. So the definition of United Nations is a sustainable development is a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It's a very standard definition. But how does it apply, for example, for practitioners in the field when you convert this definition into more practical terms? So we always look at these three aspects. Of course, these are the core aspects that we look at when it comes to sustainability. So we are looking at the environmental aspects of it, the social aspects of it, and the economic aspects of it. When you look at sustainability, and of course, these are the core pillars, but beyond that, you can still expand it further to look at because these are all interconnected and each has an impact. And so these are also applied, for example, in the corporate terms as well for companies when you're looking at sustainability. And right now, it's also being applied for cities in general, but the end, because cities can be there or countries or in the whole world, so these three factors have to impact. For example, the recent case with the pandemic. So it's a social issue, it's a health concern, but it also has an important economic consequence and also environmental consequence, and also where people live, how hygienic it is in terms of an environmental perspective also affects the social aspects of it. So it's all interconnected. And I think when right now, so the thinking of cities and managements, earlier it used to be a very different concepts when they were morely focused on economic growth and probably look at social progress, but maybe environment was not given so much importance. And now there is a lot of focus to think more holistic approach, and you are looking at all the three aspects in total. And then when you apply the term to urban development, so this is a definition that I liked, which basically from a conference from a Berlin paper that I found, which I think is quite relevant for how we look at sustainable urban development. And essentially, it's like the development that contributes to improving the quality of life in a city that includes ecological, cultural, political, institutional, social, and economic components, and without leaving a burden on the future generations. So I think this is something, the last part where you're not leaving a burden on the future generations. This is something that has become very, very prominent in discussions right now. For example, is the Conference of Parties, the UN annual climate conference is happening in the UK, in Scotland. And I think this is something that is coming up more, that we need to leave a better future for the future, for the young generations. And I think this conversation about including all the aspects of the sustainability from ecological, cultural, political, institutional, social, and economic components are very important in order to solve the current challenges that we have in our societies. And I think it's also relevant for all around the world. I think, and especially now with the ongoing pandemic, and so we have kind of seen the importance of not just the economic aspects, but also the other aspects of the society that is very important. And I hope that at least here I've seen that the political discourse has changed a lot towards incorporating a lot of the non-economic factors into decision making. And I think I hope that also happens around the world as well. And so I also want to touch upon the when you talk about sustainable cities, I think that the topic that we cannot miss is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, because that's something that is a global kind of targets that the United Nations have set, all the countries around the world have set in order to reach the sustainability goals for 2030. And I wanted to stress upon the fact that why cities matter. That's very important, when you talk about perspectives. Is right now about almost 50% of the humanity lives in cities. So it's like right now we are in a very rapid phase of urbanization, especially in the developing world, in Asia, in Africa. So these are the continents that will be with the maximum urban expansion that will be happening. For example, in Europe or North America or Latin America, the rate of urbanization kind of has reached its peak. And whereas in Asia and Africa, there is still a lot of scoping. So especially in India, in other African countries, there is still a lot of growth that's going to happen in urban areas. And so, but also it creates a lot of challenges. For example, almost more than 800 million people are living in slums. So that creates its own social and political and economic challenges for people, and also for the cities that they are living in. It creates a lot of social inequality, and it can lead to other issues that we are familiar with. And then in terms of from a sustainability perspective, but more from an environmental sustainability perspective, if you look at the cities, they only occupy about 3% of the Earth's surface, but they account for almost between 60 and 80% of all the energy consumption, and about 75% of the carbon emissions. So if you are really talking about tackling climate change and reducing the carbon emissions, essentially it's the cities that consume, and cities don't produce their own food. So all the food that comes in, all the energy that the cities need to to power themselves, all the materials that are consumed by urban residents, all of it comes from outside. So the potential, if you have to really tackle climate change, it needs to start from the cities in itself. So it has it can have a very quick solution if you are able to act in these concentrated areas, because it's also much more planned and easier to change compared to if you want to tackle in a rural context, for example. And then, of course, as we have seen, is also rapid urbanization has an impact on the environmental resources, water, and then the pollution that comes with it, air pollution, and also the biodiversity of both urban biodiversity and rural biodiversity. And then, so by 2050, so this is only going to get worse because of there's expected that 70% of the world population is predicted to live in urban areas. And unless we change how things are done, I think we'll have more challenges in the coming years. So it's very important that cities are considered an important aspects when we are talking about sustainability and sustainable development. And so this, just to reiterate some of the points, I think, for example, heating and because of climate change, you have extreme weather events that have become very common. But also, not all of it is because of climate change. It's also because of unplanned and rapid urbanization, where if you're also seeing it in many Western countries, how unplanned or non-planned urban growth can lead to challenges. For example, converting lakes into apartments, dry lakes into apartments. So when it rains, obviously the water has to go somewhere, so the water will flood the apartments. So not all of it is because of climate change, but climate change will make these weather events very more extreme. So the causes of the impact on the people who are living there will end up being higher. So there's something that's important. And then talking about air pollution. So air pollution is considered one of the most important causes of death, premature deaths. The World Health Organization has recognized. So that's another important aspect that we has to be considered. And of course, I already mentioned about this population that is living in slums. So it causes all the social inequalities. And so how is that managed? And also, for example, the current pandemic has also shown that living in urban areas can have its own, it has its benefits, but also it can have its own perils, because the majority of cases that have seen in most countries are in big cities. And because of so how do you also manage all this? For this, so these are some of the challenges that have kind of come up in cities in the future. For example, here, after the pandemic, a lot of people who were probably before they would like to live in a city, they now prefer to go out and live in a small town with a more forest nearby, so there is more nature, and they also want to prioritize things like that. So I think it's also changed how cities are looked at and perceived by people. And but then always there is a lot of people wanting to come to cities, but still, because cities still continue to be the place where you can progress and grow and succeed in. That's kind of considered how development happens around the world. So it's important that how the cities are designed more sustainably. And in terms of climate change, I want to stress, because that's another factor that is impacting all around cities and communities around the world. And for example, these photos are from Europe this summer. So I wanted to make, so the one photo on the right is from Germany, and the one that's below bottom right is from Greece. So and so we had a very extreme heat event where temperatures in some parts of Europe were as hot as the Sahara during the summer. And I think there were saying that this is only going to get worse as the temperatures continue to increase. And we've also seen it in India, in cities that the summers are extremely hot, and we also have extreme weather events, heavy rainfalls, floodings. So and so it causes a lot more harm because there's a lot more built up area, a lot more people are living in cities. So it results in a lot of damages. And it also affects a lot from all the economic growth that happens will also be affected quite a bit. So at least so around the world, what cities are doing is also there is many cities have declared climate emergency declaration. So right now there are more than 2,000 countries and local governments that cover almost 1 billion citizens who have declared a climate emergency. And essentially what that means is that they are now working to solve the climate crisis in both taking measures to reduce their carbon footprint, but also be prepared to make themselves adapt to the changing climate, because the climate change is already happening. Even if you completely stop all our emissions, with all the built up carbon emissions in the atmosphere, you will still have climate change happening around the world. So we also need to be prepared for that. So that's how governments around the world are planning their citizens. And it's very, because one of the important problems for cities globally is also that most of the important cities around the world are located on coastlines. So this map is kind of shows how the temperatures are expected to change. So the darker the color, that indicates that the temperatures will rise more. And uniformly, you will find that everywhere, at least in the near the equator in India, so you will still have temperature increase between 1.5 and 2 degrees that is expected to increase in the later part of the century. But for example, in the Western countries, it's even more critical, because the countries above the higher latitudes are expected to increase up to 3 to 4 degrees. And in some cases, for example, in the Arctic regions, it's supposed to increase up to 5 to 6 degrees, 5 degrees and more. So this the resulting, if we don't change how we do development and growth, and we continue to do the business as usual scenario. So this is the scenario that awaits us, and it can have a lot of implications for the cities, because all the major cities around the world, the top cities, Mumbai, Chennai, or Kolkata, or in Europe, for example, London, or even Barcelona, or in New York, all of them are located along the sea coastlines. So the rising sea levels are going to have a lot of implications for cities that are located on coastlines. So that will create even further problems for cities. And but then we also have to look at that this effect of climate change will also not be felt uniformly. Yes, you will have impacts, but then the damages and the impacts that will have will also depend on, for example, the social economic development of regions. So the poorer regions will be affected more, because they don't have enough resources to plan and prepare. And also that happens at the city level as well. The cities, the people who have more resources, or they are able to build a better house, they are able to have a housing insurance, so they will be able to manage the impact of climate change better than poorer communities who don't have access to resources or don't have insurance, for example. And also, governments, in terms of how a city is managed or how a country is managed, will also have a lot to do with, how ultimately the citizens are impacted. So, for example, here in Barcelona, we already, in Europe specifically, we also already have, apart from migrants, refugees who are coming from war, we also already have climate refugees, or climate migrants, we call them, coming from North Africa, because there, because of continuous droughts, people are leaving their countries, and they are migrating desperately to Europe and other countries as well. So how do you also manage this? And I think this is also something happens in Indian cities as well, that when there is a drought or flooding, you end up having a lot of migration coming from rural areas to urban areas in search of work. So these are things that needs to be considered when you're talking about cities. And then an important aspect is water security of cities. And for example, the regions that are expected to be most affected are Asia and like China, India, and but also Africa as well, and the Middle East. So these are things that needs to be planned well in advance. And so when you're talking about embedding both climate change mitigation and adaptation, so just to be clear, when you're talking about climate change mitigation, so these are efforts to uh, that reduce the emission of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, basically contribute to mitigating climate change. And adaptation are things that measures that are implemented in order to adapt to manage a future scenario of climate better. So these are two concepts that are very important in the aspect of sustainable city. So there are multiple strategies that are being in place, and a combination of these, both from climate change mitigation and adaptation in urban planning and design, is now being implemented. So when you're talking about an urban development, before we didn't have to think so much about these concepts, So now, but everything is being thought about, at least needs to be thought about for the future, because it's not just that you have a plot of land and then we start building cities or towns without planning, but now we need to consider a lot of factors apart from the environmental footprint those cities will leave. So we are talking about, for example, how do you make the urban systems more efficient, and also the form and layout are very, very important when you're talking about sustainable cities. So for example, in a place that are for example, here in the Mediterranean cities, the weather is very, very hot in summer, and so you will find that the cities are very, very dense. But then if you go to very colder places, or places that are so you would find that the cities are more spread out. And so this form and layout again depends on the geography and the latitude of the place where we come from. So it also impacts a lot in how a city is sustainable. I think I will cover about these topics later. And then, of course, also about construction materials, and how we can use local materials to construct cities, and also, for example, playing with more sustainable materials and sourcing. So this is also important from the health quality of life of the residents, but also from a perspective of the energy consumption and resistance to climate change, for example. And then critical aspect in cities is the vegetative cover, the amount of vegetative cover, because it can help to reduce the impact of climate change in the cities. And so one of the important parts, as I mentioned before, is how cities traditionally have been designed in accordance with the local geography and the local economic development and the culture of the cities. So when you're talking about mitigation strategies or sustainability strategies that needs to be implemented, we also needs to be sure what is the current typology of cities that they are. So a same solution that might work in, for example, in Delhi, may not work in a city in Bangalore, because they are very different cities. So or it may not work in a city that is for example, like a very concentrated city like Mumbai. It won't work the same exactly the same in Chennai, because they are very different cities. So we need to adapt to the local conditions and the requirements of the cities. So so this was a graph that I really liked, and so it kind of shows, for example, that on the x-axis you find the density of urban areas, and for example, you will find Barcelona is very, very dense. So it's it's very similar to, for example, Shanghai and Barcelona, quite similar, very, very dense cities. But then the carbon emissions from the electricity use is quite low for Barcelona, because we use a lot of energy renewables, and also there is nuclear energy that is coming from. But you will find, for example, cities like the US cities are very inefficient, because they're also they have a lot of urban sprawl. So you end up having a lot of cities that are very, very large, and so you need to have cars to drive around everywhere. So you end up having a lot of consumption of energy in general. And also their heating requirements are very high, or cooling requirements are very high. So you also have very high consumption of their electricity. So, but when you look at the different cities, so the different solutions, for example, electric vehicles are maybe more useful in a very spread out city, but may not be more important, because, for example, you are in Mumbai and everybody wants to have an electric car, which is good, but then that's not a sustainable thing, because you will end up having a lot of traffic problems. So the idea in a very, very dense city should be that you need to promote public transport or metro, or we need to have a more efficient system. So you need to have more frequency of metros or buses, because you are in a very, very dense city. So you also create a lot of traffic. But for example, in a city like Delhi, which is very, very large, very, very spread out, you could have, you can substitute, it could be another efficient way is to substitute their diesel or petrol cars to electric cars. So that could be a sustainable strategy. So these are just giving some examples. So the sustainability strategies that needs to be adopted also needs to be in line with the type of cities that they are in. And then, of course, another important aspect is the built environment. So these are some buildings that you must have also come across sustainable buildings in the respective cities where you are. So these are some examples from Barcelona. So we are talking about, so since we are, most of the energy that is consumed in cities are in buildings. So how you make these buildings more efficient in energy consumption, and also we spend the maximum amount of our time inside buildings. So from a more environmental sustainability perspective, but also from a health and quality of life perspective for the residents, it's important that these buildings are as sustainable as possible. And I think we're already, a lot of work has already been done in this direction. I think this, I don't want to, because there's a lot of literature on just sustainable buildings. I just want to touch upon these different topics. And then talking about, so all of this leads to, I mentioned about different strategies that needs to be done and different challenges that cities are facing around the world. And so how governments are implementing it in order to how this kind of translates at the end for the governance, because at the end for cities, the critical part is governance and how it is implemented, because otherwise I think individual citizens have a control on our homes, but when we are talking about a city in general, at the end it's the local government or the regional government that has that has the say in it in terms of how it's developed. So here in 2012, the United Nations adopted these global goals. They are called the Sustainable Development Goals for the year 2030, with about 17 different goals. And I think for sustainable cities perspective, many of these goals are very pertinent, because you are talking about poverty or good health and well-being, or education, clean water and sanitation. So there are a lot of goals that are very relevant for sustainable cities. But I wanted to just focus on two of them, which are the goal number 11, which is the sustainable cities and communities. And then goal number 13, which is climate action, because these are two that I find, especially, for example, goal number 11, of course, is very, very directly important for sustainable cities. And then the goal 13, because as I mentioned, of the impact of climate change and the relevance of climate change on the global cities perspective. Within each of the goals, there are different targets. So we are talking about, for example, goal number 11 has about 7 different targets. And if you think of from an Indian perspective, like the smart city mission of the Indian government, or and different missions that the government of India or the state governments that have, they're kind of in line with some of these targets that are there, but because ultimately India, as a member of the United Nations, ultimately we also have to report on the progress of these goals. So you'll also find how, for example, safe and affordable housing. So there's a lot of work on building urban housing by the government of India in the last since this government is in power, and also in the previous governments. And also talking about affordable and transport systems. So these are all concepts that are very important from a sustainable cities perspective, and also inclusive and sustainable urbanization. So you're talking also about inclusivity. How do you make our cities inclusive for everyone? So not just look for car users, but also used for pedestrians, for women. You have public parks for children. So these are things that we need to talk about from an inclusive perspective. And also from a cultural perspective, how do you protect the cities? A lot of cultural aspects of our societies are located in cities, the buildings, the temples, churches that we have. So how do you also preserve them? And then talking about the adverse effects of natural disasters, which is also, as I mentioned, about climate change. And then a key aspect is to reduce the environmental impact of cities. So how do you reduce the per capita impact of cities? And then looking at green and public spaces for cities. So these are different targets that are there under each under this goal. And then in the aspect of climate change, again, this is more related to capacity building for citizens and for local governments in order to strengthen resilience and capacity of when it comes to natural disasters. Because in the end, when it comes to natural disasters and managing impacts of climate change, I think technical solutions are there, but the more critical part is the governance and the capacity building at the local level that is more important in order to plan and foresee the impacts and then prevent disasters. So these are very important from our perspective. So I think there's a lot of, as you'll see in earlier, I remember when I was young, when there was a cyclone for example, in the Bay of Bengal, we used to have a lot of mortalities in those countries because there was no early warning systems in place. There was no shelters built. So now you see that there are physical damages, but for example, the casualties when it comes to natural disasters has gone down. Even though when there is an event like a cloudburst or a landslides or a rivers flooding overnight, these are disasters that needs to be predicted, but it's difficult to plan. But at least like the other disasters that used to cause a lot of death and destructions, I think the mortality has come down, at least in India, I would say. So these are things that are implemented because of capacity building, and then there's also the important target is to implement the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, for example. And when you're talking about climate resilience, so you're talking about, as I said, these are the two concepts that are there in when you're talking about mitigation, that is the actions that reduce emissions that cause climate change, and then adaptation. These are these actions that manages the risk, basically reduce the risk from climate change. So you're talking about technology implementations. So many of this will be part of for example, the smart cities initiatives by the government of India. So you have a lot of focus on sustainable transportation, renewable energy, a lot of technology innovations in, for example, monitoring air quality or smart governance and things like that. and then you have adaptations that are very important as well. So these both needs to go hand in hand in order to develop a city more sustainable. Just to next part of the lecture, I want to just give you a perspective from a European and Indian, particularly some of the strategies that are implemented, to give you some examples. So just to give you a context about Europe, and it's as some of us you would know that it's very urbanized region of the world, because here the cities, the urban concept has been there for a much longer time. So it's about 75% of the population of Europe lives in urban areas. But it's also the challenge here is it's also a rapidly aging population. So the median age here is almost twice that of the India. It's about 44 years now. So it's a very rapidly aging population. So that is creating more social and economic consequences for cities. And so this is something that is very, for example, in this context, India has a very big advantage, because we have a very large population of young people. So that's something that is good. But so considering all the challenges that I mentioned earlier about sustainability and climate change, so Europe has formally adopted a climate law in order to meet these targets. And it's the first it's first continent in the world to have a carbon neutral goal by 2050. So the idea here is that by 2030, we reduce the carbon emissions by 55%, and by 2050, it will be 100%. So this was formally adopted during this year, and they expect that other countries around the world also come up with these targets, because these are some of the goals that were agreed in the Paris Agreement in 2015. So now the countries around the world, I think India also has as a target, but not to become carbon neutral, but to significantly reduce its carbon emissions. And I will go to that later. And so here some of the metrics that are being followed here, especially now with respect to the Sustainable Development Goals. For example, there are targets on recycling of waste or air pollution, for example. So there are targets. And this part is very significant, the concentration of particulate matter, because it's considered one of the most harmful air pollutants in urban areas. As if you are coming from, especially in the northern cities, especially during now till winter, the air pollution is very bad because of this particulate matter. Because of burning by vehicle pollution and all of that. And here also it's a concern, not as much as in India, but still during winter time, for example, we would still have problems with smog and air pollution issues. And also another aspects that probably not much variation in India is also from a more quality of life perspective is the noise is also another factor that is being tracked here. And other factors, for example, how do you reduce traffic deaths and stuff, because these are some of the parameters that are monitored. And in terms of the climate action goals here, as I said, the carbon or greenhouse gas emissions reduction target, and the reduction target by 2050 is 100% reduction target. And they also track in terms of how the global temperatures are increasing and how it's relevance for Europe. And as I said before, the countries like, for example, European countries, the average temperature rise is almost double that of the global average. So it's the effects here are much higher in terms of climate change, because you're facing a significant rise in temperatures compared to other parts of the world. So they're also more they give a lot of importance to it. And then when you're talking about Indian context in this sustainable cities, I think since I think you would also, I just put these numbers to give you some context, but since you must be already aware that there is huge over the last 20 years, there is a huge increase in urban population in India, and And it's a good thing because India is one of the fastest growing developing countries in the world. But it also creates its own challenges for cities and the citizens who live there. So if, for example, Bangalore, we are talking about this. Just I used to live for 5 years working with Infosys before, and so I put a photo of Bangalore. But also Bangalore has its own challenges. For example, traffic is something that is one of the worst traffics in India. And but it's also a very green city, so there are good things and bad things like in every city. But the good thing that is expected is that by 2035 India will be home to the 17 of the 20 fastest growing cities in the world, because the economic growth of China is slowing down because they have also hit like their peak, and now the next growth in terms of growth, all that is expected to be in Indian cities. Um, but we already have our challenges in big cities. So you have, for example, there's a photo from Mumbai. So for example, there's a huge issue with housing, where roughly 50% of the city residents live in slums. So how do you also tackle these issues? And so when you're talking about sustainability, all of these aspects also needs to be considered. And yeah, I think something that we all familiar with. For example, we talk about air pollution, and the most of the Indian cities are in the top 10 or top 20. If you look at it, at least 15 are from India, and the rest are from China. But I think Beijing, China has done a lot to reduce its air pollution, but India, I think we are still in that phase of depending on the seasonal variations, a lot of things. But and also because of the geography of, especially in the northern part of the country, where the air gets trapped during the winter months, so you end up, the air pollution gets worse. But then one is the environmental consequence of it, but also on the impact on the residents' health. So we are one of the countries where it's supposed to impact the health of the population significantly from air pollution. And we've also seen during COVID the implications of living in cities, and it also reduces the lung capacity, and it can lead to people developing more severe forms of developments from COVID complications, but also if your lung capacity is compromised. So everything has a kind of a circular connection, and I think these are things that hopefully this pandemic has changed the way we perceive things, and hopefully that these things change in the future. But how India's doing a lot of work in order to solve these problems, as I mentioned before. And so, and for example, in SDG 11, so we have different indicators talking about urban housing, reducing the percentage of slum dwellers in India, or waste management, or recycling of wastewater. All of that, these are some of the targets that the government of India has, that it gives to state governments. And also, as I mentioned, some of the schemes that are done by government of India for in order to meet these objectives in this goal. And especially one of the important ones is the 100 smart cities mission that the government of India is implementing across the country. So in terms of more information, I would, if you're more interested in this topic, you can look at the Niti Aayog Sustainable Development. They have a report that they publish every year. And so this is the scorecard for all the different states, and for this particular goal. And they have goals for they have a scorecard for every goal, so you can also look at other other goals as well. Excuse me. And I think one of the so you will see that again the scorecard of each state is influenced by the scorecard of the big cities that are there in the same. For example, Maharashtra or Haryana, like these are bad performing states because they also have, for example, Maharashtra has Mumbai and it has its own challenges, and West Bengal has Kolkata and it has its own challenges. So and the good performing states are the ones in green. Gujarat or Himachal Pradesh and of course Goa and Sikkim are smaller and they are easier to manage. So these are different scorecards, and the ideal target is to reach the target of 100% in the coming years before 2030. And this is a very interesting report, so I would recommend you to have a look at the report in order to have a better understanding of India's strategy as well. And continuing with that, I wanted to use an example from this report, which is the takeoff case of Chandigarh, because it's like the top ranked union territory in the report. And since all of you are familiar, most of you would familiar, like it's Chandigarh is considered also one of the, from an architectural perspective and also an urban planning perspective, one of the finest examples for many in the last 20th century. And for sustainable cities, I think the urban planning and design is very, very important, because once you get the design right, and then it's easier to implement sustainability practices and in the day-to-day management of the city. Just to give you some stats, we are talking about 1 million plus city. It's also a union territory, and it's also a joint capital, as you would know, and it was designed by a French architect, Le Corbusier, in the 20th century. So it was designed after independence. So I think what I liked about I was looking at just for the lecture, I was just reading a bit about how Chandigarh was planned, and I think the architect's vision for it was he kind of looked at it from a human body. So we are talking about different aspects of the city, very similar to how Barcelona was thought of, and when they were looking at the designing. So we essentially look at what ultimately the citizens will do. So they need a working place, they need a living place, they need also need to care for the body and spirit, and also they need to circulate, which is very important. So accordingly, he designed the different parts of the city, and they are called as sectors. On each sectors, you will have all these aspects are in a particular sector. For example, you'll see a layout of a sector, so you would find the four different aspects that they are talking about, and in a particular sector. And of course, his architecturally, his buildings are very very important from an architectural perspective. May not be smart, because during that time they were not very smart, but from an architectural perspective and energy efficient perspective, they are still quite efficient. And so these are examples I wanted to touch upon, because these are also examples from India that I like, and in many parts of older cities in India also, unfortunately, with a lot of rapid urban growth, we have challenges in many cities that we are facing. And some of the measures that they are implementing, that is also now being implemented in other cities because of the smart city mission. So there's a lot of development that is happening in India, for example, with respect to urban transport, like the metro systems or public bike sharing schemes, etc., or solar installations, and also with respect to treatment, recycling of wastewater. I think Chandigarh is at a right scale. It's not very big, and it's also managed. The governance system is very efficient because it's also a union territory. So you also gets managed directly by the central government. So there is a lot of, in terms of there is an effective governance in the city, how it's done. And I think that's very important also for from a sustainable city perspective. And I also like the fact that it still maintains a very high percentage of green cover in the cities, which is very important from a perspective of quality of life for residents, and also to reduce air pollution and the impacts of climate change. And one of the things that I wanted to point out, for example, the greenhouse gas emissions per capita of greenhouse gas emissions for Chandigarh is almost half of the Indian average. So there are cities that are very high. For example, if you go to Delhi, or if you are looking at Gurugram or Bangalore, or these are very cities that have very high energy consumption, and Chandigarh has a very low consumption. So these are goals that cities are trying to move to. And then it also has its sustainability challenges. So because still air pollution has a high, there are challenges, because a lot of problems with air pollution is, one is the vehicular traffic, but also what happens around the city. So you also have to deal with for example, stubble burning during this time of the year, with farmers burning stubble, or during celebrations, for example, Diwali time. So you end up having very high air pollution levels. And it also has highest density of vehicles in India. And because it's also a very economically very rich city, so it has a very high density of vehicles. So how do you, I think from a sustainability perspective, the idea, at least for here, is not about owning cars. I think it's also considered a kind of an important aspect from an economic perspective for many citizens, but also from a perspective especially in a dense city. It's not about owning a car, but it's like about how do you reduce the need to use that car. So it's always okay that we are able to use the cars to visit once in a while, once in a week, that you want to take, but then there is no public transportation options, so that you're forced to take the car every day to work or to go shopping. And so it creates a lot of traffic, and it creates a lot of pollution. And especially in a dense city, that creates its own problems. For example, in Barcelona, the traffic, the personal vehicle use, even though the ownership is quite high, the personal use is only 20%. The rest 80% is either public transport or you just walk. So that's something that we plan, especially in a dense city. And I think that's a very important aspect that to consider for Indian cities as well. And then it's also a landlocked union territory, so there is no possibility for further expansion. So they need to make sure that this situation doesn't change over the years when the population grows. It should not lead to further congestion, further pollution. And so these are some of the sustainability challenges that they are facing. And to compare, I just want to go back to Barcelona. There's an example that I mentioned. So there's the financial district that you'll see on the left side, and the Eixample district that was designed by Ildefonso, and still it is kind of, but here the sustainability challenge was there is a lot of cars. So it used to be Barcelona has one of the highest density of car ownership in Europe, because during the Summer Olympics, so the whole region was developed, and it's has a lot of cars. So one of the important sustainability challenges for the city council, especially when it comes to address climate change, is how do you reduce the number of usage of cars and promote public transport or walking and etc. in the street, because it reduces the pollution. Just to give an example about, because just like in Indian cities, I think during the 70s and 80s, we also, Barcelona also had a lot of issues about crime and inner decay of the urban city center, because a lot of people moved out to suburbs, and the central part of the city was kind of, there was a lot of crime, poor neighborhoods. It's also one of the poorest neighborhoods of the city. So what they did was, during the 1992 Summer Olympics, which was hosted by the city, they used that to transform the city. So they built a lot of parks. So, for example, all the lot of street works, a lot of institutions were built in the city center, where the crime was very high. So it kind of creates that sometimes some neighborhoods become like a ghetto where other people don't go, and it kind of creates a very closed and crime infested regions of the cities. So they were also looking at from a social perspective, and now so you have a lot of parks, and for example, the access to the beaches, all of that was completely changed during the transformation of Barcelona. And then an important aspect they did was they wanted to redevelop parts of the city instead of going for new development. So it kind of, they want to prevent what happened with other cities where you're creating a lot of urban sprawl around. Then you would need a lot of cars to come inside on. It kind of creates a more inefficient way to move around and transport yourself. So they were looking at reuse of brownfields and to reduce urban sprawl. And then so some of the buildings that were built and the parks that are built in order to facilitate people to be there and use the public spaces as much as possible. And so this, all of this kind of also results that in Barcelona, for example, has one of the lowest emissions of carbon emissions, the GHG emissions, greenhouse gas emissions for ground transportation. So you would see, for example, the US cities that have a lot of urban sprawl, for example, Los Angeles or Denver, because you would need a car to go around everywhere because they don't have it's a very spread out city. So you would need a car to go anywhere. So it kind of results in a very inefficient way to move around, and it creates a lot of emissions. Whereas Barcelona has since a very dense network and has a good public transportation network, so it results in good reduced GHG emissions. And also in terms of climate plan, so they are looking at reducing their carbon emissions. These are some of the targets that the city has by 2030. And they are looking at multiple initiatives, right from, because it's a coastal city, so they need to manage ensure that the sea level rise and extreme weather events don't impact the city, from biodiversity to reducing emissions. So multiple things that are done in the city. And another interesting concept that has been experimented here, now it's become very popular around the world, is something called super blocks. Essentially, you're reclaiming the streets for the citizens from cars. So this is photos from this is the neighborhood where I live, so close to where I live. And so 5 years ago, they decided an experiment to completely cut off access to cars, and they, instead of 3 lanes, to provide just 1 lane for cars and the rest for parks and pedestrians to walk around. And now the residents are quite happy about it, and now that model is being implemented around the city. So earlier, for example, the photo that you see on the right is an area where it used to be just cars. It was just for designed for cars. So it used to be 3-lane roads and now these are all completely cut off for car traffic, and now it's usually for residents with parks. So it kind of creates more urban spaces, green spaces for residents, for places to meet. It also promotes local economy, because people go there to shop, to go to a restaurant and things like that, and also has a better quality of life for residents. And so now this model is being kind of implemented across the cities in different parts of the city, where before it used to. So the key part is that that before you reduce all these measures, it also need to have a good public transportation network or a bike sharing scheme, because the city has a very good bike sharing scheme. So people have alternatives. So I think that's something that is important to be implemented also when you're talking about Indian cities. And just to quickly, in the last part of the session, I think the next 5 minutes, I want to spend 5-10 minutes, and then we can have some time for discussion, is talking about the city indicators. So because we're talking about in order to implement and transform a city into more sustainable, you also need to measure and track and the progress that the cities make in order to, that's very basic for any transformation that happens, that you need to track and monitor and then see how you're progressing in different aspects of a sustainability journey of a city. So you're talking about three different aspects. So you're talking about the economy, the environment, and the social aspects, as we were talking about. So there are also different indicators. So this is just an exhaustive list, but of course, depending on, as I said earlier, depending on where the city is located, the type of geography, and also how the city is built, the population, etc. The weightages that you give that they can give for these different indicators can be different. So depending on what is more material, what is more important for certain cities, the weightages can be different, and then in the end you can have a different score based on what it's measured. So you're talking about the economic aspects in terms of maybe it's a GDP growth, but also environmental aspects are a lot of things considered, for example, green spaces, mobility, air quality, water issues, and then the social aspects as well. So these are some of the indicators that can be used by cities to track. And this is exactly what is being used in India by NITI Aayog to track the Sustainable Development Goals progress of different states, more or less something similar to this approach. And then based on these frameworks and different way of weightage and tracking them, there are numerous frameworks and tools that are being used around the world. And different countries use different frameworks. So these are some lists that are used in Europe and in China, in North America, and things like that. And India, as I said, by the government of India is being tracked by NITI Aayog. And I have used some of them for when I was looking at my masters. For example, the European Green City Index is something developed by Siemens. It's quite interesting. I've also used other, for example, the European Union, which is the government of EU, has its own European Green City tool, similar to what GOI, Government of India, has for Indian Indian states. So this also can be applied for India, different cities as well. So these are some of the different frameworks that are in place. But I didn't want to go. I don't have time to go to each and go in detail. But if you are more curious, I think you should. I would encourage you to look at it. And last part a bit about this concept of infrastructure resilience, because you're talking about climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. And I also wanted to introduce the term resilience. It's become more interesting in the context of being preparedness for eventual disasters. It could be both man-made or natural disasters. And essentially, apart from sustainability, it's also a concept of how do you get back to a system or a city to be up and running immediately after a shock. So if there is an incident, a disaster, so how the city is prepared enough to observe the shock from the disaster and get back to on its feet. And I think this concept of resilience. So we are talking a lot about, apart from the environmental aspects, there's a lot of focus on the social, political, and the governance aspect of cities in order to become more resilient. So it's another interesting topic that's being also looked at, more or less technical, but more social sciences and aspects that we are looking at. So there's a lot of work around vulnerability and risk assessment and risk management is essentially to reduce risk. So I also wanted to introduce that topic. And the last part, since we are talking about smart cities a lot, and it's important that we also talking about how technology is now being used, because that's the future that we are heading to. So you're talking about Internet of Things technology for different aspects, talking about mobility, smart governance, everything is digitized now, so you end up having a lot of implementation of smart technologies. But the key part that I want to mention, for example, the smart buildings, so you have everything with an app or with sensors that are tracked and monitored. But it's a key part that is that your smart city may not be always very sustainable, depending. So it's very important that this is considered that a smart city can it might be very smart, may not be very sustainable. So because it might still be consuming a lot of energy, it might still be there is a lot of pollution because you still have to use a lot of cars. So these are things that we need to also consider when you are talking about sustainable cities. And some examples that I found interesting. This I found when I was in Japan 2 years ago. Toyota, many future cities are being built around the one is this city that is being built by Toyota for its employees. It's a small city that's being built as like a kind of a model that Toyota wants to build across Japan. And it wants to be a completely sustainable city with autonomous vehicles and homes, such a completely smart homes that monitor the health needs of the citizens and are also important aspect of quality of life for them. So, and very low pollution and things aspects. So these are like the future cities that are being planned in the future. And this is the last slide that I have about the cities of the future. So we also have to talk about the cities of the future, because you're talking about almost 10 billion people, almost 3 billion people more will be added in the next 20, 30 years. But nearly 70% of that population will be living in urban areas. So the challenges will be much more. So I found this some of the design principles from an architect firm in Europe. They are looking at what is the future of cities will look like. Of course, you're talking about smart buildings, but the smart buildings will try to incorporate the maximum natural elements as possible, and also looking at the changing demographics. And so you're going to have a very lot of older population. So how do you build the cities in order to cater to the demands of the aging population and different type of jobs that the cities are going to have, because you may not have a lot of industrial jobs, you'll have more service jobs in the future. And also you're going to have faster the communication between cities. So it will not be just one city, but it will be a hub of cities, and it will be a mega city that typically that's how they are envisioning cities to be in the future. And also resilient regions. So essentially, in order to be cities will also be probably be moved. Some of the cities that we know today will also be moved to more interior areas in order to because they do predict that the sea levels are going to raise. So so that also needs to be designed to be resilient for the future. And also talking about self-contained neighborhoods, where the cities of the future are also able to produce the resources that they need for their needs in terms of food, in terms of energy, materials that they need. They can also be produced locally. And so these are some concepts that are already implemented in small aspects in different cities currently, but these are the cities that concepts that will be probably become more mainstream as we continue to grow in the future. So so I come to the end of the lecture. So thanks for patiently listening almost 1 hour and 15 minutes. I'm happy to take questions as if you have any questions. I know there's a lot of information, but please feel free to ask me any questions that you have. Yeah.
There is one question in the chat box.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so the question I have is, what is the role of green building or eco building in smart cities? Okay. As I was quickly, I mentioned about the role of, because at the end, cities are made up of buildings. The role of green buildings or eco buildings, as you call them, is very, very critical. Both perspectives. One is in order to reduce the energy footprint or the resource footprint of a city, because the maximum energy consumption of a city happens inside building for heating or cooling, and all the lighting, electricity needs that we need in the city. But also in order to protect the citizens and also to prepare the cities to be more resilient for climate related natural disasters that can happen. So how do we design these buildings in order to be more efficient and more better prepared for changing temperatures or weather factors and stuff. So my opinion, so the buildings are very, very important. And then in terms of the next question, is it true that coastal cities like Mumbai going to be in, okay? Well, I think the predictions are that most global coastal cities will face sea level rise. It's already gone up slightly in the past previous years, and it is expected that there will be more. It won't be like it will, but there will be a gradual increase. And what, for example, in Barcelona that we've seen is that it's not, we don't notice it on a day-to-day basis, but when there is a storm, and if there are conditions there are many times that the beaches are completely destroyed and then the water can come in. And I think in Mumbai, I know that we have a coastal dike that protects the city. So probably it needs to be raised higher, and we need to have more drainage systems in place in order to ensure that the water is spent out. But the likelihood is that most global cities like New York or Mumbai will face flooding in the future. Yeah. But again, the amount of flooding will depend on how much the temperatures increase and the factors. So that's why there's a lot of importance to reduce the CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. Okay, the next question is, the climate change is damaging many areas this year, especially heavy. How can we go for sustainable development? Okay. I think the one of the aspect is from my experience here is zoning, proper zoning and implementation, because there's a lot of, in Indian cities there's a lot of unplanned. It's also because of the challenges that Indian cities have. So you have a lot of net migration of into cities, and you don't have space to grow. But also we need to have is proper zoning measures in order to be clear about what type of development is permitted in certain parts of the city. Just to give an example, in Chennai, I know because my sister used to live there and I used to visit Chennai a lot, is that it's a city, essentially it's a city made of lakes, and but it's also seasonal lakes. So during the dry season it completely dries up, and so it's completely flat land, but it's a good for so there's a lot of development that happens in those areas. And when it rains, obviously the water has to go somewhere, and it's a flat city, so there is a lot of flooding happens. So not all of it is, as I was saying, not all of it is because of climate change, but it's also how development happens, and when people are more exposed to these, it results in more damages. So one of the key parts that cities needs to do is proper zoning measures to prevent unplanned and unscientific development that happens in the cities. Yeah. And then and the importance of green ratings in green building. As I mentioned, the green buildings are very important from a sustainable city perspective, and it can very important both from for
we have a separate session on green buildings also.
yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
We have a separate session on green buildings also. So I think
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. I think there is one.
Tanuja, question from Tanuja.
Okay. When we talk about sustainable building, is it same for sustainable houses, and is it cost effective? Yeah, I think in terms of, if you look at typically when you say sustainable buildings, it's usually for commercial office buildings, but there is also a green LEED, I think, rate certification for homes. So we're also talking about the end. It's a very similar principles that we apply, and it's a smaller scale, and some of the, because the use at the end is different when you look at homes versus an office space. So the parts are some of the indicators are different, but it's the concept is, at the end of the day, it's the same. I think that's all.
Yeah. The questions are over. Thank you, Digu. I think you would have a separate 5-day session for sustainable cities. So that much of topics you have covered. Thank you.
No,
Thank you.
I did my. It's very broad topic.
Yeah, you did masters in it, is it not?
Yeah, I think and each topic is very broad. But my idea was to give an overall perspective for.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you. It was very much informative and interesting. And thank you so much for devoting time for us. And I request Aisha to give an official thank.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, sir. That was really an amusing session. So thank you for the excellent session and being a part of a faculty development program. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, thank you, Aisha, and thanks everyone for your time, and look forward to in contact, and let me know if you have any further comments. I will be happy.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Digu. Thank you.